What if almost everything you think you know about Singapore's economy is actually wrong? Singapore gets called a miracle, a tax haven, a rich man's playground, and a tiny island with no resources that somehow became one of the wealthiest nations on earth. But here is the twist. Many of the stories people repeat about how Singapore got rich, and what its economy actually looks like today, are simply not true. Some are outdated. Some are exaggerated. And some were never true at all. Today we are breaking down 10 of the biggest lies about Singapore's economy that almost everyone believes, and giving you the real story behind each one. By the end of this video, you will understand this small island nation in a completely new way. Let's get into it. Point 1. Singapore has no resources, so its economy is fragile. This is probably the most repeated line about Singapore, and it sounds true on the surface. The island has almost no farmland, no oil wells, no minerals, and it even imports most of its water and sand. So the assumption follows naturally. Surely an economy built on nothing must be shaky and could collapse at any moment. But this idea gets the story backwards. Singapore's lack of natural resources was not a weakness that held it back. It was actually the reason its leaders were forced to build something far more valuable: human capital and world-class infrastructure. Because the country could not rely on digging wealth out of the ground, it invested heavily in education, in ports, in shipping, in finance, and in becoming a hub that connects other economies together. Today, Singapore's port is one of the busiest in the world. Its airport is consistently ranked among the best, and its workforce is highly skilled and multilingual. The economy runs on trade, logistics, finance, technology, and services, not on raw materials. In fact, having no resources removed the temptation many resource-rich nations fall into, becoming overly dependent on one export and neglecting everything else. Singapore had no choice but to diversify from day one. So instead of being fragile, this forced diversification created one of the most resilient and adaptable economies on the planet. When global trade shifts, when technology changes, when new industries emerge, Singapore pivots quickly because it was never anchored to a single resource in the first place. The so-called weakness became its greatest strength. Point 2. Everyone in Singapore is rich. Scroll through social media and you will see luxury cars, sky-high condos, and rooftop pools, and it is easy to assume that every single person living in Singapore is swimming in money. The truth is far more complicated. Yes, Singapore has one of the highest numbers of millionaires per capita in the world, and its average income figures look impressive on paper. But averages hide a lot. Singapore also has real income inequality, and there is a significant gap between the top earners and everyday workers. Many Singaporeans work long hours in retail, food service, cleaning, and other essential jobs, earning modest wages that barely keep pace with one of the highest costs of living on Earth. Housing, while largely subsidized through public housing programs, still requires years of saving. Healthcare, education, and daily expenses can stretch a normal household budget thin, especially for older citizens or lower-income families. There are also many migrant workers in Singapore, from construction to domestic work, who earn far less than the glamorous image suggests, and their contribution to the economy is often overlooked in the shiny skyline photos everyone shares online. The government does provide strong social support systems, subsidies, and public housing that genuinely help most citizens live comfortably, so it is not a story of despair. But it is also not a story where everyone is rich. Singapore is a place of extremes, incredible wealth sitting right next to real financial pressure, and understanding that nuance gives a much more honest picture of the country than the postcard version most people see. Point 3. Singapore is just a tax haven. People often say companies only move to Singapore because of low taxes, painting the entire economy as one giant loophole for corporations avoiding taxes elsewhere. It is true that Singapore has a competitive and relatively low corporate tax rate, and this does attract international businesses. But reducing the entire economy to a tax trick massively understates what is actually happening. Singapore built one of the most efficient legal systems in Asia, with strong contract enforcement and low corruption, giving businesses confidence that their investments are protected. It created a stable political environment where policies do not swing wildly from year to year, something investors value enormously when making long-term decisions. The government invested heavily in world-class infrastructure, from ports to airports to digital connectivity, making it genuinely easier to run a business there compared to many neighboring countries. English is widely spoken, which removes a huge barrier for international companies trying to operate across Asia. The workforce is highly educated and multilingual, meaning companies can find skilled talent without months of searching. Singapore also sits at a strategic geographic crossroads, making it a natural hub for shipping and trade routes between East and West. If low taxes were the only draw, dozens of small nations offering even lower rates would be just as popular, yet they are not. Businesses choose Singapore because the whole package works together: tax policy, legal stability, talent, location, and infrastructure. Calling it just a tax haven ignores decades of deliberate, careful economic planning that created something far more durable than a simple loophole. Point 4. The Singapore dollar is pegged to the US dollar. This one gets repeated constantly, especially by people comparing currencies, but it is technically inaccurate. Many people assume Singapore uses a fixed exchange rate tied directly to the American dollar, similar to how some smaller economies peg their currency to a stronger one for stability. In reality, Singapore uses a much more sophisticated system called a managed float against a basket of currencies from its major trading partners, not just the United States. The Monetary Authority of Singapore lets the currency move within an undisclosed band against this basket, and it adjusts the policy periodically based on economic conditions like inflation and growth. This approach gives Singapore far more flexibility than a simple peg would allow. Instead of being locked to the ups and downs of one single currency, the exchange rate reflects a blend of trading relationships with China, the United States, Europe, Japan, and other key partners. This system has actually been one of the quiet secrets behind Singapore's economic stability. Because exchange rate policy, rather than interest rates, is the primary tool used to manage inflation, the central bank can respond to shocks in a very targeted way. When global trade tensions rise, or when a major partner's currency moves sharply, Singapore's basket approach cushions the impact rather than forcing the local currency to swing wildly in one direction. This is a subtle but important distinction, because it shows a level of monetary sophistication that a simple peg to the American dollar would never allow, and it is one of the reasons economists often study Singapore's approach as a model for smaller open economies trying to manage global exposure. Point 5. The government controls everything, so it is basically socialist. Because Singapore's government plays such a visible role in housing, transportation, and major companies, some people assume the entire economy is centrally planned and government-controlled, almost like a socialist system in disguise. This misunderstands both what socialism actually means and what Singapore is actually doing. Singapore operates a market economy with private property rights, competitive businesses, and open trade, all core features of capitalism. What makes it unique is that the government also owns significant stakes in key companies through investment arms, and it directly builds and sells public housing to the vast majority of citizens. But owning shares in an airline or a telecom company, or building affordable housing, does not mean the state controls every business decision or every price in the economy. Private companies compete freely in Singapore, foreign investment flows in without heavy restrictions, and entrepreneurs can start businesses with relatively few barriers compared to many other countries. The government's approach is better described as strategic and pragmatic rather than ideological. It steps in where it believes long-term national interest requires stability, such as housing and key infrastructure, but it otherwise lets market forces operate. This hybrid model, sometimes called state capitalism, is actually one of the more studied and admired economic strategies in the world precisely because it blends government foresight with market efficiency. Confusing this careful blend with socialism misses the entire point of what makes Singapore's approach so distinctive and, frankly, so successful compared to purely centrally planned economies. Point 6. Singapore has no poverty or homelessness. Because Singapore looks so polished, with clean streets and gleaming towers, many visitors assume poverty simply does not exist there. This is one of the more comforting lies, but it is still a lie. Poverty in Singapore is real, it is just less visible than in many other countries because of how public housing and social systems are structured. There is no official poverty line published by the government in the same way many other nations calculate one, which has led to debate among economists and social workers about how to even measure the problem accurately. Independent researchers and non-profit organizations have documented elderly citizens working physically demanding jobs well into their 70s simply to make ends meet, families squeezed by rising costs of living, and low-wage workers struggling despite the country's overall wealth. Homelessness does exist too, though it looks different than in Western cities, sometimes hidden in void decks under public housing blocks or less obvious public spaces rather than visible tent encampments. The government has expanded social support in recent years, including cash assistance programs and subsidized housing for vulnerable groups, showing that policymakers recognize the issue is real. But recognizing a problem and eliminating it are two very different things. The polished international image of Singapore, built through careful urban planning and strict public space regulations, often obscures these harder realities from tourists and even from many residents who do not interact with lower-income communities. A truly complete picture of Singapore's economy has to include the people struggling beneath the surface, not just the impressive skyline everyone photographs. Point 7. Singapore's economy is all about banking and finance. When people think of Singapore's economy, banking towers and financial districts often come to mind first, leading to the assumption that finance is basically the whole story. Finance is genuinely important. Singapore is one of the largest financial hubs in Asia, but it is far from the only pillar holding up the economy. Manufacturing still plays a massive role, particularly in electronics, precision engineering, and pharmaceuticals, with global companies running significant production and research facilities on the island. The petrochemical industry is another major contributor, with Jurong Island hosting one of the largest integrated chemical hubs in the world, refining and processing materials that feed into global supply chains. Logistics and shipping remain absolutely central to the economy, given the port's position as one of the busiest transshipment hubs on the planet, moving goods between continents every single day. Technology has also become a massive growth sector, with Singapore actively courting startups, venture capital, and major tech company regional headquarters, turning it into a genuine innovation hub rather than just a financial center. Tourism, biotechnology, and even agri-tech research focused on food security add further layers to an economy that is intentionally diversified rather than dependent on one industry. This diversification was a deliberate policy choice made decades ago, precisely so the country would never be overly vulnerable if one sector, like finance, faced a downturn. Reducing Singapore's economy down to just banking ignores the careful, decades-long strategy of building multiple strong industries side by side, each supporting and reinforcing the others. Point 8. Singapore just copied Hong Kong's success. This comparison gets made constantly because both are small, dense, trade-focused Asian economies that grew rapidly in similar decades, so people assume Singapore simply followed a blueprint that Hong Kong created first. While the two cities share some similarities, the idea that one simply copied the other oversimplifies two very different paths. Hong Kong's rise was closely tied to its position as a gateway into mainland China, benefiting enormously from proximity to a massive and rapidly opening economy. Singapore, on the other hand, developed its strategy around being a neutral hub connecting many different regions, not primarily one giant neighboring economy, which required a different approach to trade relationships and diplomacy. Singapore's government also took a far more interventionist role from the very beginning, directly investing in industries, building public housing at massive scale, and creating sovereign investment funds to manage national wealth strategically, an approach quite different from Hong Kong's more hands-off, laissez-faire economic philosophy. Political structures diverged sharply as well, with Singapore functioning as an independent nation making its own long-term policy decisions, while Hong Kong operated for decades as a British colony and later navigated a unique relationship with mainland China. These structural differences shaped completely different economic tools and priorities over time. Singapore invested heavily and early in becoming a global hub for oil refining, then later semiconductor manufacturing, industries that were never Hong Kong's primary focus in the same way. So while both cities share the label of Asian economic success stories, calling one a copy of the other ignores the genuinely distinct strategies, historical circumstances, and government philosophies that shaped each economy along its own separate path. Point 9. Free markets alone explain Singapore's success. There is a popular narrative, especially among free market enthusiasts, that Singapore proves low taxes and minimal government involvement are all it takes to build a thriving economy. This story conveniently leaves out one of the most important parts of the real picture, the massive and active role the government itself has played as an economic player. Singapore's government runs sovereign wealth funds that manage hundreds of billions in assets, investing strategically both domestically and internationally to generate long-term returns for the nation. It also holds significant ownership stakes in major companies across airlines, telecommunications, utilities, and other key sectors through government-linked corporations, meaning the state is not just a referee setting rules, it is also directly participating in the economy as a major player. Public housing, built and heavily subsidized by the government, houses the vast majority of citizens, a level of direct state involvement in daily life that would be almost unthinkable in a truly hands-off free market system. Long-term economic planning, including deliberate decisions about which industries to develop decades in advance, from petrochemicals to biotechnology to green technology, reflects careful government strategy rather than pure market forces being left alone to sort things out naturally. None of this means Singapore is not market-friendly, it absolutely is, with open trade and strong protections for private business. But framing the entire success story as simply the government stepping back and getting out of the way erases decades of active, deliberate, and often quite bold state intervention that worked alongside market forces rather than instead of them. Point 10. Singapore became rich almost overnight as an economic miracle. The word miracle gets attached to Singapore's story so often that people start to imagine its transformation happened suddenly, almost like flipping a switch from poor fishing village to gleaming financial capital. This framing, while dramatic and inspiring, understates just how much hard, deliberate, and often painful work went into that transformation over many decades. When Singapore gained independence in 1965, it faced serious challenges: high unemployment, minimal infrastructure, ethnic tensions, and genuine uncertainty about whether the small nation could survive economically at all, let alone thrive. What followed was not luck or a sudden miracle, but decades of consistent, disciplined policy choices, sometimes controversial ones, made by leaders willing to take a very long-term view rather than chasing quick wins. Massive investment poured into education starting from the earliest years of independence, building a skilled workforce over an entire generation rather than overnight. Infrastructure like the port and later the airport were expanded and modernized continuously, requiring sustained investment over decades rather than a single burst of spending. Industrial policy shifted deliberately over time, moving from basic manufacturing in the 1970s, toward higher-value electronics and petrochemicals in later decades, and eventually toward finance, biotechnology, and technology in more recent years, each transition requiring careful planning and patient execution. Housing policy transformed the physical landscape gradually, block by block, over generation after generation. Calling this a miracle, something magical or accidental, does a disservice to the sheer amount of strategic effort, sacrifice, and patience involved. Singapore's story is less about luck and more about proof that consistent, long-term planning executed over 50-plus years can genuinely transform a nation. So there you have it, 10 widely believed lies about Singapore's economy, finally set straight. From the myth of a fragile resourceless nation to the misunderstanding of its currency system, and from the overnight miracle narrative to the reality of inequality hiding beneath the shiny skyline, the real story of Singapore is far more layered and far more impressive than the simplified version most people carry around in their heads. This is a country that turned scarcity into strategy, blended government foresight with market energy, and built resilience through decades of patient, deliberate choices rather than luck or shortcuts. Understanding these nuances does not make Singapore's success any less remarkable. If anything, it makes the real story even more inspiring than the myths ever could. If you learned something new today, or if one of these lies genuinely surprised you, hit that like button so more people can see this video. Drop a comment and let us know which one shocked you the most. We read every single one and love hearing your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because we break down economic myths just like this one every single week. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.